Welcome folks. Today is 23rd of September 2021, and this is Anthropology and the Human Condition, and lecture number 2. Okay. Which is today about field work. And what we'll do today is I'll talk for an hour or so. You can interrupt with any questions anytime. Then we'll have some questions and chat and a break. I want to show a little bit of film, then a break. And then we will do some reading of the text. The text this week was Michael Young's text, What Did Malinowski Eat in the Field? We're talking today about Malinowski, but not just Malinowski, but yeah, this guy. At the end, I want to also try and introduce you to some of the context in which he worked and actually what's happened subsequently to his work, which was 100 years ago. Well, next year will be 100 years since his book, Argonauts of the Western Pacific, was published, his first book. And the reason for talking about Malinowski, he is a student of the people I was talking about last week, but he is the person whose name is used to signify the massive change in anthropology from general anthropology. In social anthropology, he's the name attached to its methodology. And he introduced, he didn't invent, he introduced and popularized the methodology of field work and participant observation. And we'll talk about what that is today. So I'm introducing you to this man who's standing there in his three-piece suit, pocket handkerchief, and his little round glasses, very nice tie and cravat, leaning on a rail or a shelf, a mantelpiece perhaps. Actually, it looks a bit staged. He doesn't really know what to do with his right hand there. It's kind of like hanging, almost looks a little bit, his suit looks a little bit long in the sleeve, don't you think? And maybe his trousers are a bit big. But anyway, maybe that was the fashion back then. He was a dapper anthropologist, right, of the time. And the fieldwork method of social anthropology is today still considered necessary for anyone to become an anthropologist, to the point where before I'd done fieldwork and I spoke to a senior anthropologist, I said, "Oh, hi, I joined the staff of Deakin University." I introduced myself to the anthropologist, and I said to her, Diane Bell it was, I said to her, "Hi, I'm John, I'm an anthropologist too." And she said, "Where did you do fieldwork?" And at that point I hadn't done fieldwork, right? But I had a job in anthropology, so I thought I was an anthropologist. No. Not until you've done fieldwork. And PhD students are expected still pretty much all to do fieldwork. And to avoid it is not really possible. Even though to really do it like Malinowski set it out is also not really possible. Like he said, you go and spend a year, at least a year, if not more, living among the native people, as he called them. No longer the savages of last week from the Victorian anthropologists, but still kind of pretty problematic way to talk about people. Spend a year living in a tent, learning the language, learning a new language in 1 year, and participating in their daily life so that you can observe as if you are a local and see things from the native point of view, which is quoting him. Imagining no one notices the disparities between a white European and the natives that he's. But anyway, Malinowski is the name that British social anthropology uses as a kind of brand marker to sell its fieldwork method for courses in anthropology. Yeah. Now, what I've said in this course already, and I'll say to you too many times, I'm sure, is that this is the idea of going to have a look for yourself. And it's a method that at least challenges some of the assumptions and prejudices that the 19th century anthropologists had in the 1800s, right? By having a look for yourself, you must at least confront some of your prejudices. But as we'll see, not all. And we're going to talk about Malinowski and his photographs. That's my way into it, because, you know, this photograph of him, for starters, and photographs all the way through, including some of the things that Michael Young talked about in his essay, What Did Malinowski Eat in Papua? In Anthropology Now, the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute, which is Anthropology Now. I thought Anthropology Today was the Journal of the Royal. Have to check that. Michael Young, in this article, really doesn't talk about what Malinowski ate so much as talk about what he didn't eat, and talk about some of the photographs or things that are represented in photographs and in his diary. Famously, after Malinowski died, his daughter published his diary, and we have a lot of insight into the man, and that broke with some of the myths, including many of the things about his methodology of fieldwork. But let's get into his biography a little bit first. He is a follower of Fraser, who wrote the introduction to his first book, Argonauts of the Western Pacific, and he was a student of Seligman and had traveled to Australia as a secretary to the Commonwealth Anthropology Congress, and so was living in Australia, was still in Australia when World War I broke out. And because he was Polish, right? So Malinowski, the name should give you the clue. Malinowski was Polish, actually a philosophy student who he had studied with a guy called Mach, M-A-C-H, a philosopher, and in Poland, and then he transferred across. He stayed friends with Mach, but he transferred across to England because he'd been reading Fraser, The Golden Bough, exactly, and he studied anthropology in London and became a student of Seligman. But because he was in Australia and World War I broke out, being Polish, like the World War I war was largely between England and Germany, but Germany had Poland in its orbit. He became an enemy alien. When I say the wars between England and Germany, we could do a whole course on World War I and its complications, of course, naturally. Because it led to the Bolshevik Revolution in some senses, right? It's very important for our history, but also England versus Germany, but they didn't fight it in England or Germany, often like wars. They fought it in France. It didn't, of course, it affected the home countries, and then Australia was involved, for example, in the war, heavily involved, fighting in the trenches in France, in the Somme, and literally thousands of soldiers died from Australia, and in the Gallipoli in Turkey, because Turkey was then on the side of Germany. The English kind of used German and Indian soldiers as the front line troops. The generals sent them in with little regard to how many they would lose at a time when the technology of war was changing. Anyway, well, that's a separate possible course. thing is that Malinowski was in Australia and he was an enemy alien, so they were considering what to do with him. Should he be put in jail because he was his enemy, or as some anthropologists wrote him letters of support, he was sent into exile into Papua New Guinea. Not exactly exile. He was sent on a mission to kind of help the Governor General of Australia, Governor Hunt, thought that having Malinowski, an anthropologist, a trained anthropologist there, would help with native administration, because the Australian government had taken over the administration of Papua New Guinea. Formerly it had been a German colony, and at the beginning of the war, taken by the English off the Germans, Australia had adopted it from England. So Australia was responsible for continuing the pacification of the people, right? The stopping tribal warfare and protecting the missionaries that had gone in to teach the natives about Jesus, and so on. And so Hunt thought that Malinowski would help with native administration, and so he allowed it. Malinowski first goes to Maelu, an island off the coast near Port Moresby, and does a short report which proves the value of him being there. And then he turns up on the Trobriands. He goes to the Trobriands. And here we see in the photograph, like this famous photograph from Argonauts of the Western Pacific, of the ethnographer's tent on the beach. And here, this is a powerful and symbolic photo because you've got the lagoon, the water, so you're invoking the idea of the island and the tropics, all the coconut trees are there and so on. And we see the ethnographer's tent right, it says on the beach, but the real message is right inside the village, right among the native life, right? It's not like he was visiting them from anywhere up the road or a planter's hut or house or something like that. He was living right there. So every day when the rooster crowed to wake people up to the campfire songs of the evening, he was within earshot and participating in their everyday life, which is his ideology, his methodology. You need to understand the people, you need to participate in their everyday life every day. Right? Of course, it turns out, we know from the diary and from the letters, that he doesn't spend all of his time living right there amongst the natives, as we'll see. He's back and forth to traders' huts and to Port Moresby and back to Australia for a large part of the, like, they say he did, some people say he spent 4 years in the Trobriands. He didn't exactly. He never claims to spend 4 years in the Trobriands. He went back to Australia at one point for 20 months. Right? I think the longest stint he did on the islands was 9 months. Where are the islands? Okay, I have a map. You can see a little bit. It's a pretty bad map, but you can see the map there off the northeast coast of Australia to the east of the Papua New Guinea mainland. Papua New Guinea became independent from Australia in 1972, I think, when Michael Somare won independence from the Australian government. The government had changed to Labor government, so Gough Whitlam, the big socialist, the leader, the progressive leader of Australia at the time, probably our last progressive leader, maybe Julia Gillard, I don't know, had been keen to support Somare as first Prime Minister. Of course, Australian commercial interests were still involved in Papua New Guinea, especially around Konzing Rio Tinto and the mining company, their largest hole in the southern hemisphere on the island of Bougainville. Anyway, the Trobriand Islands are a group of islands just on the east of Papua New Guinea, not far away from the Solomons, separate country, but Yeah, it's a whole group of islands as well that make a unit, the Trobriands, and yeah, pretty remote in many ways, but they had a very particular culture, especially of seafaring. And so the important thing about this photo, another important thing about this photo of the tent in the beach is there at the other end of the beach, we see some of the like boats that the Trobrianders were famous for sailing around the islands. And they sail around these islands and they exchange in a system of ritual adventurous sailing. For example, rough seas, they have to be quite good at sailing, but they travel from island to island, and there's established relationships with other island groups, which are driven by a symbolic exchange of arm shells called kula shells and cowrie shell necklaces that have huge reputations. And Malinowski's main work was to show that this exchange of kula shells in one way and cowrie shells in another, cowrie shell necklaces in another, was a symbolic exchange. There were stories told about who had owned these shells, and it was very prestigious to exchange one. But the exchange relationships between those who owned the shells was the opening to being able to make other kinds of exchanges in the market in a place. Yeah, where's my slide? Yeah. So here, there's their boat, the kind of boats they traveled on, Trobriand canoe, I suppose. He first thought, I'm not getting in that, I'm sure. And it turns out they're very good seafarers, and they exchange these symbolic exchange, which enables other kinds of exchange. Like once you exchange the shells, you made the trip, you've exchanged the shells, and the business of confirming the relationships have been done. Then you swap food and fish and taro and coconuts or whatever the tools, whatever you brought to trade. But that's the secondary part. The most important part is this symbolic exchange of shells. And Malinowski's point was to say, in his book, was sort of to say, look at this strange behavior by these people. They're going off to trade, but they really trade these symbolic, so potentially valueless things, just shell art objects. Yet let's look more closely at this strange behavior. We see it's actually very coherent. It establishes a relationship which allows other trade to go on, exactly like Europeans do, right? So we have symbolic exchange of money, and then that allows exchange of objects, all right, commodity fetishism and all that complicates it. Or even just to go to the market, for example, thinking of a necklace that the Trobriand are wearing. I went to the market on Monday because I got out of quarantine, and to go into Lotte Mart for the first time in ages, I had to rub some magic potion on my hand, the antiseptic hand wash, and then I had to put on a necklace, a lanyard, which gave me a symbolic power and a number 33 to enter into the market. And then I did my normal trade, bought some eggs and some bread and stuff, and then I left. I gave back the symbolic magic necklace and could go on my way. Okay, we think that's completely, it's a bit weird, but it's pretty normal. So too the Trobrianders thought that had developed this institution of exchanging shells in order to then be able to do the rest of their market. And Malinowski finds this out by participating in that trade with them, and he learns it over the years, 4 years on the islands, right? He learns it by participating and observing and seeing things from the native point of view. But then when he writes it up in the book, he writes it up in a way that makes out that he is on this great adventure. So his first sentence is imagine yourself set down, surrounded by your gear as the motor launch that delivered you now sails off in the distance. You know, it's a romantic South Sea island, Robinson Crusoe-like thing. He's been left alone with his tent to set up on the village. But in reality, that's just literature, because he arrived with the police. The local administrative authority, a policeman, introduces him to the village and says, look after this guy. It's not like he's just dumped there alone. And you see this, the motor launch that delivered you sails off in the distance. Well, motor launches don't sail. That's wind power. Motor launches have that doesn't matter that's wrong. The whole thing is he's being kind of literary, making out as if he's the adventurer, explorer on his own. Of course, he's not on his own, because there are the Trobrianders that live there. We see that, of course, but you know, the white man and the others. So he's being literary, like he imagined himself as like a character in a Robert Louis Stevenson's book. Robert Louis Stevenson, he wrote Treasure Island, and he lived in the Solomons, North Solomons. He wrote about the South Sea Islands, and he wrote a lot of island night entertainment, fantastic stories about pirates and adventures. And although Malinowski said he wanted to write more like Joseph Conrad, who was probably the #1 writer at the time, The Secret Agent and Hearts of Darkness, which you might know as the story of Kurtz going upriver and going increasingly crazy because of the strangeness of people, the native people that he didn't understand, and eventually he loses it completely, going the horror. And that book was the basis for Francis Ford Coppola making Apocalypse Now, about the American-Vietnam conflict. Oh, well, Cambodia part of it, and it's a bit mythical, but where a soldier goes off grid and has to be removed by the administration because he is teaching the hill tribes to fight a dirty war. Anyway, so Malinowski is very literary in his presentation, and that sort of has made the story of Fieldwork a little mythical. He was also trying to create a career and to transform anthropology, which he did with the help of his wife, eventual wife, Elsie Masson. At the time, he was engaged to Elsie, and trying to get that book published. Eventually, Elsie helps him write the book. Apparently, he writes, like I mentioned this last week as well. He writes in his gift copy to her, "Dear Elsie, for you who had at least half the work in putting this book together." But selling the book was really hard because it was about the other side of the world for a European, for an Englishman, a Polishman in England. And it was rejected by 39 publishers, apparently. And if Methuen were not going to, the 40th publisher, Methuen, were not going to take it, Malinowski said to Elsie, look, if they don't take it, we'll just give up and go into the margarine industry, selling margarine. We nearly didn't have Malinowski's Anthropology. Well, except that the study of the cooler is really important, but the introduction of fieldwork method by Malinowski, that might have come about anyway because he didn't invent it. And yeah, that's kind of important. The guy who much earlier talked about participant observation, or from which Malinowski learned his got this idea, is Frank Gillen, who's the gentleman in this photograph on the right-hand side of the photo, the left as you look at it, the fatter of the two sitting down, right, the more portly gentleman. The guy next to him is Baldwin Spencer, who was the professor of zoology at University of Melbourne, my old uni. In 1900, he'd come out from, or 1894 or something, he came out from England to set up the Department of Zoology, but he had a great interest as an evolutionist in social anthropology as well. And by 1915, Malinowski was staying in his house, right, and managed to read all the letters of Gillen to Spencer. And Gillen had been living in Central Australia, and in this photo you see he's living, some of his friends in the photo, the back row are Erlikiliakira and Purula, the two Aboriginal men in this photo, and a mounted trooper called Trooper Chance. They're there, and while I don't know anything about these guys, it's significant that they're being photographed because Gillen had lived there so long as the postie, as the postmaster, that he'd gone from, when he first arrived, really supporting punishing the Aboriginals for any kind of, like when they threw a spear at a white man, to becoming the protector of Aborigines. Right, and that's in the tradition of what I talked about last week, how the Anthropological Association began as the protectorate of Aborigines, to eventually, when he becomes a protector of Aborigines, he prosecutes a white policeman for killing two Aboriginals, which is unheard of at the time, because basically when whites arrived in Australia, they slaughtered everyone. All the blacks. I mean, they enslaved or slaughtered. I mean, it's not called slavery. It was called blackbirding, but it was slavery. And kidnapping of potential workers for sugar plantations and so on. I mean, that's slavery. But it was called blackbirding in Australia. And it went on long, very late. In fact, Aboriginals didn't get even the vote until the 1960s, and still highest rates of leprosy and so on. Anyway, Gillen had lived 20 odd years in much longer. He ended up living in Central Australia, and he got to know the Arunta people that live in that area around Alice Springs. And Baldwin Spencer met him by chance, and they got on very well. Baldwin Spencer, this skinny guy, right, professor of zoology from Melbourne, keeps on going into Central Australia, a couple of weeks trek in those days, just to stay as long as he could with Gillen, and to join him as he went to observe and participate in many of the rituals of the Arunta. And in fact, there's some suggestion that Spencer and Gillen were both initiated into the Arunta tribe, accepted as tribesmen. Although that's contestable, of course, because, you know, how do you get to do that as a white man, except as maybe as an honorary? Yeah, so Malinowski stayed in his house. Gillen and Spencer wrote these books together, Native Tribes of Australia and the Northern Tribes, and travelled around the northern area, Simpson Desert and edge of the Simpson Desert, of course, and the Arnhem Land and so on. And Spencer was the one who wrote up the books, but Gillen was writing to him all the time, even when he was not there, for example, especially, well, mainly when he couldn't chat to him, he would write to him about, you know, oh, I wish you'd been here last week when I was invited to a ritual of the men where they brought out their sacred Chiringa stones, and they carried them reverently as if they were the crown jewels, and so on. And he writes about and thinks about how he's come to know these Arunta people so well. We actually have still Gillen's correspondence, which is what Malinowski read. was able to read inside Spencer's house. Spencer kept the correspondence. Spencer's letters to Gillen are missing because Gillen died and his wife burnt all his stuff. Understandably, I suppose, but because why do you carry junk around in Central Australia? But tragedy for the history of anthropology. Because those books that they wrote together have been so influential. They are much discussed by people like Emile Durkheim, the sociologist from France, whose Elementary Forms of Religious Life quotes them a lot. Sigmund Freud, the psychoanalyst from Vienna and later London, used their work, talked about the Aboriginal family in Totem and Taboo. Especially they talk about the incest taboo. And Marcel Mauss, a student of Durkheim, but a brilliant anthropologist and theorist, who wrote The Gift in 1925, which we'll look at later when Jacques Derrida takes up the question of the gift. And we might look at that later in a later week. The point is that Spencer and Gillen's work were massively influential in these texts, even before Gillen's work, his letters inspired Malinowski with the idea of going to have a look for himself and to live amongst the natives and be right there. In fact, here he is, photographed amongst the natives, Malinowski and the guys. I guess I want to ask you, what do you see in this photograph? Like, can some people say, what? Anyone? So I can volunteer people to speak. Just describe what you can see. Erin, you can speak, but she said black people. Yeah, some black people, one white person. They are Trobrianders. What else? We need to be trained in how to read not just text, but also how to read an image. Okay? Maybe Aboriginal. They are Trobrianders. Yeah, Aboriginal people, I suppose, original people of the Trobriands. They're from Papua New Guinea. Trobrianders, yeah. So when you read a text, you look for what it's saying. Why would someone include this? And you read a photograph as if it was a text. You say, why would someone include this text in this photograph in their book? It illustrates Malinowski talking to the natives, although they're not talking. You don't see anyone's mouth move. In fact, the expressions on the faces are a bit hard to read. Three guys on the left of the photo, to Malinowski's left, seem completely bored. The guy with the afro is looking very quizzically at Malinowski. If you are going to comment on this photo, you might mention what he's holding. You can't work out what it is, but it's some kind of pot and something for stirring the pot. Might be an instrument or something. The other guy, the next guy along on the right, is also wearing an instrument, whereas the third guy looks like he's just observing, right? He doesn't look like he's not even sitting on the log. They're sitting on a log, so it's like maybe the edge of a clearing. Behind them is jungle. when you describe this picture, you would be missing something if you didn't point out the difference between the clothing that the white guy is wearing and the clothing that the Trobrianders are wearing. One wearing a kind of sarong, the rest in just a loincloth or just a penis covering, nothing else. Maybe they have some bag over their shoulders, or they wear some neck shell jewelry, head shell jewelry. Not much else. But the white man is fully head to toe dressed. And, you know, not just, he didn't just chuck this shirt on, right? He's obviously got puttees on. Yeah, these are tie-up foot, almost knee-high feet coverings. I mean, white clothes in the tropics is a good idea. You don't get as hot. And it's symbolic for the photo, right? For the book, because the idea of the introduction of the book is that you need to spend time amongst the people learning their way of life. And that this photo kind of is saying that, like the tent photo. Malinowski is there among the natives, right? And there's another photo of him, was also in the book, very similar position, like sitting in the same position almost, hands on knees, almost. Dressed the same way, although it doesn't show in this photograph because of the contrast. And weirdly, in this one, you see some other things going on. The chair and table there with a typewriter on it, looks like. So we can guess that he's sitting, like for the photograph, because you have to stay completely still in those days for a photograph. You can think that he's posing in a break from doing some anthropology work of recording life stories or, I don't know, kinship systems or relationships, births and marriages and so on, or gardens or something, from these Trobrianders who are sitting lower down on the ground in front of that hut, quite an established hut, but like in decreasing in size. So it's probably a whole family have come to have their moment talking with the anthropologist. So he's recorded himself working. It's a photograph of himself doing anthropology, the same as this one. It's, you know, it's the symbolic of the encounter between the scientist, the researcher, and the people. And here is the scene of research again. Although, you know, it's a pause in the process of research, because to take a good photograph, to get everything in color, you need everyone to stay really still for a number of, like a minute rather than seconds. Camera technology was not so developed back then. Good metaphor. Like this bit out of focus because it's a snapshot photograph of Malinowski with a quite huge camera trying to take an action photograph, which, you know, we should be pleased that he's taken cameras to his fieldwork, probably one of the first. And while he himself admits that he's not a very good photographer, and a lot of his photographs were out of focus like this, he does attempt to do this semi-scientific work of photographing and recording and so on. But that's interesting in itself, because you get snapshots. Even if photographs are not true representation, they only show one side, they're small and flat and black and white, and you don't see any of the color of the society. They are used to carry a message. I mean, another famous photograph, it was used on the front of a book in the mid 80s to talk about the writing of ethnography, is this photograph of Malinowski at work again, the same scenario. He's in his tent. What I want you to develop, actually, from looking at these photographs is skills in reading the image. So one thing you can ask yourself a number of things about what you first notice in that photograph. And one thing you see is that the natives are watching him, but he's not watching them. You can look at the direction of looks inside a photograph. Okay, who's looking at who? In fact, in all of this, in this photograph, I think Malinowski is looking at his work, I guess. Looking at the page coming out of his typewriter or something. The others are nearly all looking at him, except for maybe this guy second from the right of the photograph, the left-hand side as you look at it. The right-hand side, the left-hand side as you look at it, sorry. This guy seems to be looking through the tent at the camera. These two guys standing up looking at the ethnographer. You know, we should think that's significant that one person is looking at the camera because someone else must have taken the photograph, which makes us recognize that Malinowski, even though he presents himself as alone on the island, there are obviously others there, you know, and somebody's taken this photograph. In fact, somebody had taken this photograph that wasn't Malinowski, right? And as we'll see, it turns out to be a guy called Billy Hancock, who was a friend and trader. He lived just up the road, and should be credited for taking so many of the photographs. Like he was 2 hours row away from across the lagoon to the north of the side of the lagoon. Hancock, and I mean, this is breaking down the story of Malinowski being alone in the village, because there was obviously the trader Billy Hancock nearby, and there were other traders as well. Another trader, Mick Malinowski. In fact, you see him here in that white suit still on the veranda of a trader's hut. He's talking again to some Aboriginal, some Trobrianders. But it's Billy Hancock that is most significantly there. This is quite well into the fieldwork. You can see from Malinowski's big beard. He's grown, stopped shaving while in the field. But Billy Hancock was reputed to be a bit of an alcoholic. So later on, he's looking a bit frail in this photo, whereas the earlier pictures of him, here he is, one taking a photograph. He does look a bit portly. Anyway, this photograph's interesting. This is Billy Hancock taking a photograph, and next to him is probably the assistant Ginger that Malinowski hired from a nearby island that Michael Young talks about. I mean, this photograph also tells us a lot. This wasn't included in the book, but if we look at it, we see again the size of the camera. It's huge, and Hancock is taking his photograph of, like, where he's got the camera is pointing for us out of shot, right? So what he's photographing we don't see, but we do see these kids on a log, right, sitting on a log, and what we can work out then is that this log continues along, and in fact is the very log that Malinowski is sitting on in the earlier photo that we looked at. right? The continuity of the log goes under Malinowski's sit. And in fact, Malinowski at another point was doing the same photo as Billy Hancock, right? They're both taking that photo. This is not a very good photo, this one. This is a really, but he's taken Billy Hancock's place, so to speak, in the photograph. But it's to make this photograph. So we have this photograph in its act of making when Billy Hancock is taking the photograph, or at least Malinowski has photographed the photograph being taken. A photograph of a photograph, mise en scene, they call that, this vortextual representation. But there's the thing, Malinowski wasn't alone, and the scene of research of the anthropologist doing participant observation really with the people is a little bit of a fiction, because it's staged for the camera, right? And in fact, we know from the diary that Malinowski wrote that there was a lot of staging going on. Okay, the diary is amazing. It was published in 1967, so long after Malinowski died. It's in several languages at the same time: English, Polish, German, Latin, and Trobriand's. And it tells the stories of Malinowski and his how he feels about his fieldwork, and his battles with depression and anxieties about and loneliness and boredom while in the field. He reads a lot of novels. Joseph Conrad in his tent. He gets sick of the natives. It turns out he's a human. The presentation of the field worker in that introduction to Argonauts of the Western Pacific, where it's work, 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 do the field work, and all these high sounding sentences, is really contrasted with the very human and contradictory ways of the anthropologist, bored and lonely and grumpy and angry and all sorts, expressed in his diary, which he didn't write for publication, which his daughter published, although she did still cut out some parts, but published as a warts and all story. Yeah. So the point of talking about the difference between Malinowski's presentation of the methodology of fieldwork, which we should understand, fieldwork, go off and spend a year in some place and really try and participate in everything there and live daily life is well and good, and yet you can't really do it without recognizing some real assumptions. And the staging of the research forgets all these, or omits or excludes all these very real things, like you'll be lonely, you'll be, I don't know, have your own concerns in your tent. I mean, Malinowski is concerned about his illness, his health a lot. He's very worried about, he's got like hypochondriac. He thinks he's sick every time he eats something. He gets headaches. He's doing his own self-administered medicine and so on. And he's worrying about his ethical side as well. His relationships with the native girls is a problem for him. He's worried about whether or not he'll betray his fiancée, Elsie, back in Australia, although it turns out he had 3 fiancées. Elsie, who he eventually married, but there were 2 others, a bit scandalous. He's concerned about self-abuse. He's alone in his tent. We shouldn't need to know about what he does in his tent on his own. But yeah, the diary shows him being very human, and the myth of anthropological method as fieldwork had been created and honed and developed by this persona of Malinowski, the great field worker, and that have been forced down the throat of PhD students doing anthropology for decades and decades. You've got to do it like this, and still today, it's kind of that model of doing fieldwork, going and living at least a year. You know, I know from trying to learn Tibet, and you will know from learning English, you don't learn a language in a year. Not to the level that you need to be able to understand what's going on. I mean, you can learn tourist level, a bit more than that maybe. I mean, I'd say my Tibet's not even 50% yet. If you're 4, like my daughter, 5, and you lived here for 3 years, you can be fluent, yeah? Annabelle Ratot Tibet, right? She can speak, but if you're an adult, you don't learn a language in a year, even if you're brilliant and already know 4 or 5. And what two of the, like, he's doing his methodological fieldwork, asking the natives for their point of view. Why would they share it? Why with this white man who arrived with the police, who's dressed like a strange kind of alien god visitor, dressed in this white suit? Why would they not try and tell him what he wanted to hear? And we'll see this as an issue for other anthropologists. Like we look at Margaret Mead, for example, the girls that she interviewed in Samoa. Apparently they made up stories to entertain her because they knew what she liked, and she would give presents if she got good stories. Of course that's going to happen. And how do you, with your 19th century prejudices, get past that hierarchy that you belong to the colonial occupying power and the differences? And then Malinowski, as the guy who's come into the Trobrianders with a mission, he's come with a purpose, which is to take from them their knowledge and write a book. And yeah, he does battle to get that book published, but the idea is he's come with a particular plan, which is like an economic extraction, a business plan for himself to get the knowledge that he can then put into a book to build his career. And he becomes Professor Malinowski. Whereas the guys whose knowledge he puts into the book, they just keep on living in the Trobriands, okay? And in fact, some later Trobrianders have said that they feel that Malinowski stole their heritage. And Malinowski keeps on writing books about them even well after he's left. Like, he leaves there in June of 1918. And he doesn't go back, but he writes the first book, as I said, Argonauts of the Western Pacific, in 1922. But then he writes 2 more books in the next, 15 years, Coral Gardens and Their Magic, and sensationally titled Sexual Life of Savages, which isn't about sex, really. It's about kinship relations, like who marries who has children with who can, incest taboo stuff. But even in 1935, as he comes to write the preface to the last book about the Trobriands, he writes in the preface, "Here I am again, taking up my pen as the person who writes the Trobrianders into existence. I create them. I conjure them into being, so to speak." And there's a colonization of knowledge involved in that too. Somehow, I mean, think about it as what's to say? Appropriation, knowledge, heritage, and certainly, as I said, there's a sense in which Malinowski's stolen their heritage, and current or Trobrianders subsequently felt oppressed by that book, saying they had to live up to being like the Trobrianders in that book. Like, you can imagine that some youth would maybe resent having to be to participate in the recreation of that style of life when they actually want to just get down to Sydney or something and be teenagers like everyone else. Actually thinking about what modern day, contemporary 2020 Trobrianders would think about the book, I searched for some more recent representation of the Trobriands, so we could see what maybe, in this day of YouTube videos on nearly everything there is, we could surely find something on the Trobriand Islanders. And there's a couple of things I want to show you. I'll show you the first one now, which is a little bit of video filmed in 2018, but uploaded 2020. So at first I thought it was really recent. It's still very recent, I suppose, where this guy called Eddie Torresman visits, actually for the second time, he visits the Trobriands, and just take another shot like that. He visits the Trobriands and records a little video that gives us an insight into what Trobriand life is like right now. So I'll show you that, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, 5 minutes of that film. Just making sure I get the right video to share. That's the guy. And so it's Eddie Torremans. He's a Flemish speaker, so his language is a bit strange, but there are subtitles. But that's the point is not that. It's while you see from this still from the start of the film, he's in a vehicle, as we see on the left side, the right side of the images, from the image's point of view, your left, he's in a vehicle with a car, modern vehicle, and there's kids who've got clothes. The huts look pretty traditional, and the looks village-like, right? Looks very, what's to say, authentic. And so that's why I wanted to show this video, to say that, it's almost like modernity hasn't interrupted their life so much. Let me see. All right, so we'll play a little bit of this. I got to turn my sound off so it doesn't feedback. So I'll turn this off, and then I'll come back for a little chat afterwards, but then we'll have a break.
Can you give out some barrels?
We zijn hier terug aangekomen in een beetje bij het dorp van waar ik 12 jaar geleden geweest heb. Ik heb toen een foto genomen en deze meneer hier, die staat hier voor de foto. Dus ik heb er al een gevonden. Ik heb hier nog wat foto's bij, die gaan we proberen net te delen zelfs. En ik vermoed dat ik er wel in ga slagen. En deze mesjes hier, ze hebben intussen zelf al klein bengels. Die staan hier op die foto allemaal. Toch een stuk of 4 ervan. En ja, ze hebben nog.
Kamu tadi sedikit sih.
Bila bunyi nggak pelak tu,
Belag belum pelak tu. Wow. Tuh nih.
Je kunt misschien dat doen, ze een paar vissen.
We zijn hier deze morgen aangekomen op het eiland Kitava. Er woont hier 7000 man in 3 verschillende dorpjes. Ik kon er eentje van bezoeken. Het is verschrikkelijk warm, maar ja, heel rustig, paradijselijk. Daar kan ik er nog meer over vertellen. Je moet niet vragen wat
Okay, I stop it there because, well, he goes on to go and give a gift of some pens to a school and to show the great snorkeling. Maybe we can watch it during the break or something. But what's interesting is now here we see a woman has walked past him. They are heading towards that ship, that huge ship that's come, and yeah, basically what he's doing is, let's read his next sentence. He's imagine how their people are feeding, and some 1,500 rich tourists have arrived here by ship today. Like, it's almost like there's I just found this, right? I didn't think that it would be so perfect an illustration of the whole thing. At first in the video, it's almost like, right, this guy's arrived back in up to 12 years visiting in his island on the other side of the world, and he's brought some photographs, like he was almost like they've never seen photographs before, and he's showing them the magic of photos that he's printed out and laminated, and he's going exploring the island on his own. And then appears this massive ship in the middle of the picture, and it turns out there's 1,500 people there and an island group of 7,000. So they're all this rich, relatively compared to the Tröbranders, outrageously rich tourists who've arrived and just wandering around the village. And we see a couple of them in the background of his video. You know, and the girls are obviously, and the men are putting on a performance for the tourists. So they're maintaining their culture for tourism rather than what they were doing before. And the tourists themselves are you see it in this shot. Go back a bit. Can't get it. Yeah, there he is. The tourists are just in the background. See this guy in a white shirt again. The tourists are just walking around the village, not even interested in the performance, walking past it. They've been dropped for the day as an excursion of their cruise ship. right? Probably out of Sydney or Singapore or something like that. And yeah, like this is what culture for the Trobranders becomes. Their traditional culture, as fixed by Malinowski in the book, becomes a commodity to sell back to visiting tourists, who indeed no doubt can later read Malinowski's book and go, oh yeah, I was there, I've been to that island, yeah, I've seen those people, I know them quite well, yes, I took their photographs and I've got friends there in the village. Really quite interesting the way in which the relationship between Europe and traditional culture now turns into tourist marketing of heritage. And it'd be very interesting to know how the native point of view on this. I mean, they're all running down to the ship with things to sell, carrying things to sell to the visiting tourists. I mean, I'm sure they don't come that often, but when they do come, it's payday. Right? It's a bonanza day. I'll stop the recording and see if we have any questions and stuff. And we'll take a bit of a break.